They laughed at humans, hiding in the back. Their laughter didn't last long. Vorlag the Unbroken, first fang of the Cathar Imperium, let the rhythmic vibration of the dropship's deck plates resonate through his armored boots. The air was a familiar cocktail of recycled oxygen, hot metal, and the sharp, ozonic tang of charged power cells, the perfume of imminent battle. He scanned the cramped interior, his gaze a mark of ownership. At the front, his own kind, the Cathar, sat with the stoic pride of a species born to conquer. Their thick-scaled hides and powerful limbs filled the space, a promise of the violence to come. Behind them were the allies of convenience. The Aegean carapace, crustacean-like monoliths, were positioned in the center, their massive shells forming a living bulwark. They were stolid, dependable, and about as strategically brilliant as the armor plates they resembled. Flanking them were the Sisketh, a species of chittering, multi-limbed insectoids whose nervous energy was only matched by their startling speed. They were flankers, assassins, useful tools for sowing chaos. All of them were tense, their bodies coiled springs of potential energy, ready for the slaughter, all except the humans. Tucked away in the rearmost seats, the 9th Pathfinder detachment was an island of unnerving calm in a sea of martial readiness. They slouched. Their armor was dull and pragmatic, lacking the honor markings of the Cathar or the polished sheen of the Aegeans. Their leader, a sergeant named Thorn, stared blankly at the opposite wall, his expression unreadable. Vorlag's mandibles clicked in irritation. It was an insult. This summit was a critical display of the Coalition's power, and the humans acted as if they were on a tedious public transport. He could bear the silence no longer. His voice, a low, gravelly rumble, cut through the hum of the engines. "Does the scent of battle frighten you, human?" he growled, not bothering to turn fully. "Is that why you hide in the back?" Every warrior in the transport tensed, their attention drawn to the confrontation. Sergeant Thorn's head turned slowly, his eyes meeting Vorlag's in the reflective surface of a wall panel. There was no fear in them, no anger, nothing. "Just a habit," the human said, his voice maddeningly neutral. Vorlag's claws tightened on his seat's armrest, denting the metal. A habit. Cowardice was a habit. He saw it clearly. Humanity's weakness was not just physical, it was etched into their very soul. They were a species of prey, seeking the darkest corner of the burrow when the predators approached. They had no place among true warriors. He turned his attention back to the forward ramp, dismissing them from his thoughts. The landing was imminent, and the coming battle would wash away the stain of their pathetic presence. A heavy jolt signaled their arrival. The dropship's engines whined down, and with a percussive hiss of hydraulics, the forward assault ramp began to lower. Vorlag rose, his massive war maul humming to life in his grip. He expected to see a welcoming delegation, or at the very least, station security. Instead, the ramp revealed a cavernous docking bay, unnervingly silent and bathed in the cold, sterile light of the station's glow panels. A prickle of unease, an unfamiliar sensation, traced a path down his spine. This was wrong. The universe seemed to agree. The first explosion was a silent, blinding flash of white that consumed the entrance of the bay. The sound arrived a millisecond later, a physical wave of force that ripped the dropship's ramp from its moorings and hurled it inward. Vorlag was thrown from his feet, his 200-kilo frame tossed like a child's toy. He slammed into the far bulkhead, the impact rattling his teeth and blurring his vision. Chaos erupted. The Cathar warriors, bottlenecked at the front, roared in fury and confusion as plasma bolts stitched lines of fire across their ranks. The Aegean carapace valiantly tried to form a shield wall, but a second, more powerful detonation at the side of the dropship tore a gaping hole in the hull, bypassing their defenses entirely. Shrapnel screamed through the cabin, the air filled with the stench of vaporized metal and cooked flesh. Through the ringing in his auditory senses, Vorlag pushed himself to his feet, his warrior's instincts overriding the pain. He saw the enemy swarming the bay, armored figures moving with practiced coordination, laying down a withering field of fire. He let out a defiant roar and charged, his maul cleaving the first attacker in two. But for everyone he felled, two more took its place. He spared a fleeting, contemptuous thought for the humans in the back. The softskins were probably atomized in the first blast, a fitting end for cowards. The Cathar were dying, their strength and fury rendered useless against a perfectly executed ambush. The fight was a maelstrom of plasma and screams. Vorlag's war maul rose and fell, crushing exoskeletons and shattering enemy resolve on a micro level. But it was a futile gesture against a tide of disciplined fire. He saw an Aegean warrior, its mighty carapace finely breached, fall with a sickening crack. Two Esesketh lay twitching, their slender limbs broken. The Cathar had formed a wall of muscle and fury, but it was a wall that was crumbling stone by stone. They were losing. They were all going to die here in this cold, metallic tomb, and the galaxy would remember them only as arrogant fools who had walked into a trap. Then the universe blinked out. The primary glow panels, already flickering, died with a final, pathetic pop. The docking bay was plunged into an absolute disorienting blackness. The roar of battle was instantly smothered, replaced by an oppressive silence so profound that Vorlag could hear the blood pounding in his own auditory canals. The sudden absence of violence was more terrifying than the violence itself. He held his ground, every sense straining in the dark, expecting the final killing blow. But it didn't come. Instead, there were sounds that didn't belong. A soft thump, like a heavy sack of grain being dropped. The metallic clatter of a rifle falling to the deck, unprompted. A choked, wet gurgle that was cut off almost as soon as it began. There were no plasma discharges, no war cries, no thunder of charging feet. There was only a sequence of quiet, methodical noises, a percussive rhythm of death that lasted no more than 20 seconds. Then, as abruptly as they had died, the lights returned, this time in the form of dim, crimson emergency strobes that pulsed like a dying heart. The rhythmic sweep of red light painted a scene of impossible carnage. Vorlag stood panting, his maul heavy in his grip, surrounded by his wounded and terrified allies. The enemy, however, was no longer a threat. They were a tableau of silent death. One lay with his head twisted at an impossible angle. Another had a single, neat hole punched through his visor. A third was slumped against a wall, a thin, dark line drawn neatly across his throat. There were no blaster burns, no signs of a chaotic firefight. This was not the work of soldiers. It was the work of ghosts. Vorlag's wild eyes scanned the entire bay, trying to make sense of the massacre. His gaze swept past the bodies, past his own warriors, and finally settled on the rear of the dropship, and his breath caught in his throat. The humans. They were standing there, all 10 of them, calm and untouched, positioned in a loose semicircle around the exit they had never used. Their armor was pristine. Their weapons were holstered. Sergeant Thorne was calmly wiping a small, black-bladed combat knife on a piece of cloth before sliding it back into its sheath with a barely audible click. They weren't even breathing heavily. The silence was broken by Vorlag's own voice, a hoarse, disbelieving rasp that he barely recognized. "What did you do?" Thorn turned his head, his face a mask of placid professionalism in the pulsing red gloom. He met the Cathar's gaze, and for the first time, Vorlag understood that the human's quietness was not meekness. It was a terrifying, absolute confidence. "Our job." Vorlag forced his muscles to obey, to move forward out of the blood-soaked docking bay and into the long metallic throat of the station's main corridor. The distant wail of alarms was a fitting soundtrack to the unease that now coiled in his gut. His Cathar brethren, their earlier bravado replaced with a grim, watchful anger, took point, as was their right. Yet, their formation was different now. They moved with less raw aggression and more caution, their heads constantly scanning not just the path ahead, but the shadows to the sides. They encountered the first enemy patrol at a major junction. Without hesitation, the Cathar reverted to instinct, charging forward with guttural war cries. Vorlag's maul sang a brutal song as it met the enemy, the clash of armor and the wet thud of impact a familiar comfort. They were warriors, and this was their element. But as they fought, an enemy trooper took a fortified position behind a support pillar, laying down suppressing fire that pinned two of his best warriors. Before Vorlag could even roar an order to flank the position, he caught a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. Two of the humans had detached from the rear of the formation, melting into the warren of maintenance access panels lining the corridor wall. They made no sound. A moment later, the suppressing fire stopped abruptly. The two Pathfinders reappeared behind the enemy's now lifeless body, their combat knives already clean, their expressions as placid as a still lake. They had not run, or charged, or shouted. They had simply removed the problem. Vorlag's focus shifted. The enemy ahead was a known quantity, a puzzle he had solved 1,000 times. The humans, however, were a terrifying new variable. He began to watch them, trying to decipher their movements, to understand the silent language of their discipline. Their next obstacle was an automated defense turret emplaced at the end of a long, narrow hallway, a perfect kill box. The Aegean carapace moved up, their massive bodies forming a mobile wall that absorbed the turret's initial volley, their shells sparking and groaning under the impacts. The Sisketh darted about, seeking an alternate route, but found none. The advance ground to a halt. Vorlag turned, intending to consult the human sergeant to ask his assessment as a peer. "Human," he began. "Eyes forward, warrior." Thorn cut him off without even looking at him, his voice flat and final. The dismissal stung more than any physical blow. Before Vorlag's pride could curdle into rage, he saw Thorn make a subtle hand gesture. One of the Pathfinders produced a small silver cylinder and rolled it expertly down the corridor. It wasn't a grenade. It made no sound as it came to a stop directly beneath the turret. A brief, invisible pulse of energy washed over the emplacement, and the turret's angry red targeting laser fizzled and died. Vorlag stared, his mind struggling to keep pace. They hadn't destroyed the turret with overwhelming force. They had simply switched it off. It was then he truly understood. The Cathar waged war. The humans, it seemed, merely solved it, like one would solve a complex equation. And the cold, ruthless logic of their methods was more frightening than any berserker's charge. The blast doors to the station's command bridge were a fortress unto themselves. Forged from reinforced alloys, they stood as the final barrier between the coalition and their objective. In front of them, a squad of the enemy's finest guards had dug in, their heavy plasma repeaters mounted on deployable cover, creating an almost impenetrable wall of firepower. Two automated turrets on the ceiling hummed menacingly, sweeping their targeting lasers across the corridor. It was a meat grinder, a final glorious test of strength and will. A primal fire ignited in Vorlag's chest. This was a battle he understood, a challenge worthy of a Cathar. He hefted his war maul, its power field crackling to life. The other Cathar mirrored his readiness, their own weapons activating with hungry thrums. The Aegeans formed a solid line behind them, ready to absorb the initial volley, while the Sisketh prepared to skitter along the walls, seeking any small advantage. This would be a fight, one with blood and broken bodies, and Vorlag would be the first to charge. He drew in a deep breath to bellow the order, to unleash the fury of his warriors upon the foe. His voice died in his throat. The humans were already moving. It wasn't a charge, it was a disassembly. As one, the 10 Pathfinders flowed forward. One of them raised a rifle, but instead of firing a bolt of plasma, it emitted a high-frequency sonic pulse that shattered the enemy commander's visor and sent him reeling, clutching his helmet. Simultaneously, 2 Pathfinders fired grappling lines into the ceiling, swinging over the barricade to land silently behind the enemy line. Before the stunned guards could even turn, the fight was over. It was a blur of black combat knives and the sickeningly quiet efficiency of snapped necks and silenced plasma pistols. The ceiling-mounted turrets swiveled to track the new threats, but before they could acquire a lock, Sergeant Thorne raised his own sidearm and fired 2 precise shots, not at the armored turrets themselves, but at the exposed power conduits, feeding them from the wall. The turrets sparked, smoked, and died. The entire bloody, honor-bound assault Vorlag had envisioned had been rendered moot in 7 seconds. He stood frozen, his war maul feeling suddenly clumsy and absurd in his grip. His warriors were still poised to charge, their battle cries caught in their throats, their ferocious energy now a useless, impotent thing. He lowered his weapon and walked slowly through the carnage, his heavy footsteps the only sound in the corridor. He stopped directly in front of Thorne, who was already directing his team to secure the bridge. The human sergeant showed no sign of victory, no elation, only a focused calm. Why? Vorlag's voice was a raw whisper, all his arrogance scoured away, leaving only a hollow, desperate need to understand. On the transport, you sit at the back. In every fight, you hang back. You fight like specters, not warriors. Why? Thorne finally turned to face him fully, his gaze direct and unwavering. For the first time, he was not looking past Vorlag, but directly at him, as if finally acknowledging him as something more than a background element. Because from the back, we see the entire board, the human said, his voice level and devoid of emotion. Entrances, exits, cover, threats. We watch the chaos unfold and wait for the precise moment to act. The fight is over before it begins, because we choose the terms of engagement. He took a half-step closer, his quiet presence more intimidating than any Cathar war cry. You think we hide. You're wrong. We observe. That isn't cowardice, warrior. It's control. Control. The word echoed in Vorlag's mind, a simple key that unlocked a universe of terrifying understanding. The journey back to the dropship was a silent, somber procession. The boisterous pride of the Cathar was gone, replaced by a heavy, thoughtful quiet. The other species, the Aegeans and the Sisketh, seemed to instinctively give the small human contingent a wider berth, their movements hesitant and deferential in a way Vorlag had never witnessed. As they reached the dropship, the warriors began to file aboard. A Cathar, one of Vorlag's own first Fang, went to take a seat near the back out of habit, then stopped. He looked at the empty rear benches, then glanced at the humans waiting patiently on the ramp. The warrior wordlessly changed his mind, moving to a seat much closer to the front. The pattern repeated. Aegean and Sisketh alike flowed into the transport, consciously avoiding the rearmost section, leaving it an unspoken sanctuary of respect and fear. Vorlag was the last of the aliens to board. He stood on the ramp. The empty seats in the back, a stark testament to the lesson they had all learned. He saw Sergeant Thorne and his Pathfinders standing impassively, waiting for the others to be seated. Their patience was no longer a sign of weakness. It was the patience of a predator that knows its meal is not going anywhere. Vorlag met Thorne's eyes, and in a gesture that went against every instinct of his proud warrior race, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an admission, an acknowledgement. He then turned and took a seat in the middle of the craft, ceding his place at the front, the position of the Alpha, without a second thought. Only then did the humans board. They moved past the other warriors, their footfalls unnervingly light, and took their customary seats in the back. As the dropship ramp hissed shut and the engines began to whine, Vorlag stared at his own claws, finally understanding the profound, chilling truth. His people were warriors, honed for the glorious chaos of a fight. But the humans, they were something else entirely. They were not built for the fight, they were built for the win.